After weeks of negotiations ending in a deadlock, the US and China have reached a breakthrough. It's not a peace treaty to end months of trade dispute, but it was enough to convince the US president to hold off increasing tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods.
We put ourselves into a position of strength for the first time in about 35 years, or probably a lot more than that. But China has been terrific. We want to make a deal that's great for both countries.
Despite Trump's optimism, the two countries are still sparring with each other on some sticky issues. Washington has been pushing Beijing to stop what it calls forced transfer of US technology in exchange for doing business in China. It's an accusation Beijing has repeatedly denied. The two countries haven't been able to agree on how to enforce the terms of a deal should it be reached. The US wants to be able to reimpose tariffs if Beijing fails to meet certain demands, while China has called the approach unfair. But they are hoping to iron out these details before a planned summit in Florida between the two presidents. That's when they plan to seal a deal.
State-owned enterprise reform, industrial policy changes are not items that can be changed overnight or would be reasonable to expect to be resolved in 90 days. So by finding a way where the two sides can come to some kind of agreement and then put these more challenging issues into a longer-term negotiating framework should have a very positive impact on the overall relationship.
The positivity has been spilling into financial markets, with global stocks rallying on the news of the tariff delay. But Trump hasn't set out a clear deadline for the ceasefire. And while investors have been breathing a sigh of relief, analysts say more must be done to turn the tide on the trade war. Laila Humairah, TRT World.
For more on the story now, let's bring in Max Wolff from New York. He's the managing partner of research firm Multivariate. Good to have you back on the program, Max. Donald Trump has effectively brought its dispute with China back from the brink of an all-out trade war. This is a good outcome for both sides, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I think there's some value to being able to tone down your own rhetoric. I always think it's a little bit tricky to get super excited when somebody charges you protection money and then doesn't attack you. But look, it's certainly better than the alternative. The issue here being that these have been somewhat mercurial talks, and so it's hard to know what next week or next month looks like. And there's some fears floating around out there, hopefully not founded, that this is as much about getting China's help to stage manage a second meeting with North Korea as it is about any long-term U.S. trade opinions.
Interesting, but delaying higher tariffs on Chinese imports isn't really the same as reaching an agreement, is it? Donald Trump says he hopes to sign a trade deal with Xi Jinping in Florida at some point in the future. He hasn't specified when. Do you think we are close to a trade deal here? Just how far away from it are we?
So we're probably closer. I mean, look, the large impediment to the trade deal has been very anti-trade and somewhat anti-Chinese rhetoric coming out of the U.S. So to the extent that we have a reduction in that, we are that much better off. I think, look, what we're going to need for the sort of U.S. side to be happy is probably to change the name of a few agreements and to announce a big success. And they'll need something to sort of validate them. But this is much more about the Trump administration being able to say it sort of did what it said it would do and get some points and declare victory than it probably is about a big series of new agreements, because those would have had to be handled differently from the outset. And it's kind of hard to imagine that 30, 60, or 90 days would be the key difference in changing the industrial policies of the two largest economies in the world and how they relate to each other.
Yes, we also know that there is a heated presidential campaign that's pretty much launched already from both sides. We've got an election happening next year. How much of this do you think is about box ticking rather than enacting real change within China?
Yeah, so I think that's pretty much, first of all, real change with Chinese industrial policies has to be and will be the mandate of the Chinese economy, the Chinese government, the Chinese people, not probably any particular American policy agenda. So we're long since past the point, thankfully, in the world where country A makes country B's internal industrial policies, at least in most regards. So probably not for us to do. I think we're mostly expecting a sort of version of NAFTA becomes, USMCA here. So we're going to have a name change, a few tweaks about things that were particularly less than exciting for the United States. Many bold and sort of superlative announcements of massive, epic-making change from the Trump administration, and a few concessions, and probably be better off when it's all over. And I think also that the White House is a bit obsessed with the stock market, especially after it plunged in the closing sort of act of 2018 there. Very happy it's shooting up, and this will push up equity markets, if more in China than the US. It'll still be good for, let's call it the animal spirits of the American economy to have a deal here.
I want to ask you about an idea that's going around, and that is China will basically agree to any sort of a deal just to run down the clock on the Trump administration. After all, as we just mentioned, there is an election happening in 2020. Trump is by no means certain to win that election, and of course we don't know what will happen with the Mueller investigation as well. So do you think that idea is a serious one? Is there any credibility to that?
Probably. I mean, look, I think there's lots of folks inside the U.S. and outside the U.S. who don't know what the future of American politics will bring. That being said, look, I think that the way the Trump administration has handled the trade agreements and issues and disagreements with China is fairly woeful and has partially undermined the agenda. That being said, part of what we did learn through the unfortunate rhetoric sometimes selected by this president is a fair number of folks, actually on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican, have some concerns and want to see some major change with China. So I don't think it's fair to say this is just a Trump agenda. It was popular, initially really was popular for Bernie Sanders, who's just thrown his hat back in the ring. Don't know how real that is, but at least he's going to try again. So I don't think U.S.-China trade tensions was born of Donald Trump, and I don't think it dies of Donald Trump either. So there are long-term issues here, but they may be waiting for a better negotiating environment. That's possible.
There's also a lot of skepticism in the United States that even if China does sign up to a deal, whether or not they'll enforce it is a whole nother issue. I mean, how key are enforcement measures in any sort of an agreement?
Well, if you really want a long-term solution to anything, it has to be a slow, difficult process. I mean, part of the problem with the way we've been approaching in the U.S. the trade stuff is to demand a bunch of unilateral shifts with no offset and no reason. And that's the policy you always wait out, because worst case scenario, you actually have to do it. Every day later you do it is better. And I think also from the sort of Chinese versus American proposal context, the United States is a relatively strong space in a somewhat weakening global economy right now, which I think has made American negotiators more aggressive, and China's been in a sort of a tough situation, especially given their recent history of stellar growth. So I think the other reason to sort of delay this for the Chinese parties is they will almost certainly have better leverage and possibly a better negotiating partner, which, by the way, would be true even if President Trump is reelected, but if we were to see the Republicans lose control of the Senate. So lots of different roads. Statistically, they're almost certainly better off waiting for a host of reasons.
Max Wolff in New York, it's always good to get your thoughts. Thank you.